Welcome to episode 3 of Masculinity, critical study of Matthew and masculinity. In this series, I'll be navigating the world of Matthean research by identifying assumptions, connecting old and new interpretations, including questions and perspectives previously overlooked or undervalued. There's a whole world of research that awaits. Are you ready? We've got some big topics in this episode. We've got the critique of kingship and masculinity, the interpretation of the exile, the discerning of the divine will, the meaning of divine providence, and yet all this is found in verse 17 of Matthew chapter 1. Alright, verse 17 of Matthew chapter 1. If we can understand verse 17, we will be able to understand the meaning of the genealogy. From verse 2 to verse 16 is what most people call a genealogy. But is it a genealogy? Well, according to verse 17, it's the structure that is the key to understanding what it is. Well, what is it? If we want to understand what it is, we need to understand verse 17, which speaks of a three-part structure. A three-part structure in equal amounts. Here is a translation of verse 17. Therefore, all the generations from Abraham until David are 14 generations, and from David until the Babylonian exile, 14 generations, and from the Babylonian exile until the Christos, 14 generations. Well, hang on, what's all this about? What's 14 and 14 and 14 generations got to do with all this ancestry? How can the point of all this ancestry be 3 groups of 14? Why is this important? How does this help us understand what we've just read in the first 16 verses? How does it help us understand what it is that we've been reading? And yet that seems to be the intention of verse 17. It seems to be telling us something important about what we've just read. According to verse 17, the previous 16 verses are being understood in terms of their structure. So this helps us also with verse 1, because verse 1 was introducing something, and that something may have been just the following few verses, or it may be the entire book. I didn't fully resolve that question last time. Well, the answer is found in today's episode. The answer is found in verse 17. Was verse 1 introducing more than just a genealogical account? According to verse 17, what we've been calling a genealogical account is actually more than just a genealogical account. It seems to be structured in such a way that it's charting not just genealogy, but some kind of 3-part story. And so that's why verse 1 seemed to be introducing more than just a genealogy. Even if it's just introducing the first 16 verses, these first 16 verses are in fact more than a genealogy. So verse 17 is a bit like verse 1, because they're both talking about the same thing. They're both telling us about a certain kind of genealogical story map or story arc. There's a lot of uncertainty of what verse 17 means in the commentaries. My favourite comment comes from the Wesleyan commentary by Roger Hahn. He says, clearly the 3 sets of 14 were important to Matthew. Why that is so is not clear. I love that comment because it's a good summary of the state of the situation amongst the commentaries, even amongst the ones that try to guess what's going on in verse 17. And a lot of the uncertainty is around trying to understand what's the significance of the number 14. So the commentaries end up overlooking the 3-part structure by trying to focus on the number 14. And that's one reason why I won't be talking about the number 14 until next episode. I'll be saving all the theories about the number 14 until next episode. This episode, I'll just be focusing on 2 questions. Why 3 parts? And why equal parts? Why 3 parts? Why equal parts? The commentaries don't help us very much with these 2 questions. And part of the reason is because of the long process of getting a commentary into publication. It takes so long that we don't get to see much interaction with recent scholarship. There are a few studies around that look at the value of this 3-part structure for understanding the first chapter of Matthew. And in fact, if we go way back to the very early commentaries, our earliest surviving commentaries do look at this 3-part structure and try to understand the significance of this 3-part structure. I won't give all the ancient theories, but just for example, some ancient commentaries think that the 3-part structure is significant because it represents the Trinity, the 3 parts of the one God, the triunity of divinity. And another ancient interpretation was that the 3 divisions represented 3 stages in ancient Israel's leadership. The people were under 3 stages of leadership. The first stage, the people were led by judges. In the second stage, the people were led by kings. And in the third stage, the people were led by high priests. According to this interpretation, Jesus is set to take on all 3 roles somehow, as judge, king, and high priest. There are modern studies on the first chapter of Matthew, that have noticed the significance of this 3-part structure, and that the idea of the exile into Babylon, that seems to be quite significant. Okay, so what is the interpretation that I'm going to provide? Well, what I'm going to provide is basically a matter of me trying to integrate all the research I can find, combining all the research together, including discussions with my wife about how verse 17 is like verse 1, saying that Jesus is like David and like Abraham. And she asked me, how is Jesus like David? And I listened to my answers and realized that most of my answers weren't making any sense. And in fact, Jesus is much more dissimilar. There's many more dissimilarities between Jesus and David than there are similarities. And this was a major breakthrough for me in being able to see what's going on in verse 17. And so it's a matter of me combining everything I can find to help me interpret this verse. I'm not 100% there yet, but I think I'm able to give an explanation of verse 17. So here goes. Here is an explanation for verse 17. Verse 17 is telling us about the structure of this genealogical story map, being a 3-part structure with 3 beginning points and 3 end points. The first thing to notice is the mention of the exile to Babylon, which is one of the structural features of the genealogical chart. It's mentioned a couple of times in the genealogical chart, and then again it's mentioned twice more in verse 17. The book of Matthew begins in chapter 1 by mentioning a topic that other New Testament authors don't talk about, except for one other verse in the book of Acts, where Stephen is quoting from the book of Amos, mentioning the exile into Babylon. But in Matthew, the exile to Babylon is mentioned 4 times in the opening chapter. Apparently, it's an important topic in the first chapter of Matthew. In order to set the scene for who is Jesus, he is the Christos, the Messiah, and apparently the topic of exile is important to include. It's important not to overlook it, not to ignore it, but to incorporate it as part of the story of biblical Israel. The political trauma of the exile where the Babylonians came and destroyed Jerusalem and deported a large number of the population. This political trauma is something that stayed with the people as an important part of the identity of the nation. So it was important to move forward by including the trauma of the past and trying to understand it and what led to it. So the prophets wanted to look at the causes. Well, obviously it was the Babylonians that caused this forced migration of people to Babylonia, but the prophets wanted to think about it theologically and politically, talking to the people about how do we as a nation think about what's happened? How do we think about what went wrong? What do we learn from it? How do we avoid this kind of catastrophe happening again? How did we survive it? So trying to create understanding around it and to give it a context and understanding it as part of their history. So in Matthew chapter 1, we have 4 references to the exile to Babylon. And we have it within a framework. And so we can see something about how it's functioning within this framework, where it occurs within a sequence of important events that happened on either side of the exile. So these 3 events help to interpret one another. These 3 events are Davidic kingship, exile to Babylon, and the arrival of the one called Christos. Unfortunately, most commentators think that it's telling us something about counting, and we need to check how the writer is counting, and is the writer counting correctly? Well, yes, it is counting, but notice that it's about what it's counting from and to. So it's about these points, these beginning points and end points. So it's about these points in time, these major transitional points in time. Notice that it's about the starting and ending points. If we start counting from the time of Abraham until the time of David's kingship, we find a certain amount. And then if we begin counting from the time of David until the time of the exile, we find the same amount. And if we begin timing from exile until the time of the Messiah, again, we have the same amount. So the main point is not about the actual amount. It's not necessarily about the actual number. It's not about the numeral 14 necessarily. That's why I've deliberately saved all the theories about the number 14 until next episode, so as not to distract from the main point. The point of verse 17 is telling us how to read the genealogy as a timeline divided into 3 intervals, 3 equal parts, focusing on the significance of these pivotal points in time, and pointing out the intervals between these 3 endpoints. So the short answer, for those who can't wait for the long answer in the rest of this episode, the short answer for the first question, why 3 parts? The short answer is that it's pointing out a timeline constructed into 3 sections. I don't know that timeline is the perfect word. Perhaps time frame, 3 time spans. I don't have the best vocabulary yet to use for it. It's meant to be about the time frame in which the Christos will arrive. That's a better label than genealogy. What we've been calling a genealogy should perhaps be thought of as a 3-part timeline for a grand plan. I don't have a shorter label. Well, the shortest label would be to call it a story, a 3-part story, or perhaps a story map or diagram. Basically, it's a chart. It's charting the time frame in which the Christos arrives. Now, the short answer for why equal parts is that each part is of the same length to resemble a season or cycle, just like a season of time, a cycle of time on Earth. For example, a year is an equal interval of time, a portion of time that is always of the same apportioned duration. Likewise, a week is 7 days. It's always 7 days. So these intervals of equal amounts, the same duration of time amounts, when we think of something on planet Earth that's a cycle of time. But here, the book of Matthew is not talking about ordinary time, but cosmic time. So these aren't ordinary cycles or seasons. These are cycles of time of a reality greater than just ordinary historical time, according to the writer. If I had to give a 5-second answer for why 3 parts, and a 5-second answer for why equal parts, it would be this. Why 3 parts? It's a 3-part mythic paradigm. And why equal parts? These represent cosmic proportions, or apocalyptic dimensions. So altogether we have a 3-part mythic paradigm of cosmic proportions. Okay, now for the long answer, where I'll try to unpack both of these ideas. It's easier to understand the 3-part genealogical story map. It's easier to understand this schema if we don't think of it so much as the genesis of Jesus, but as the genesis of the Christos. So rather than thinking of it as the birth plan of Jesus, it helps to think of it as the plan to bring the Christos. It might sound like the same thing, because in Matthew's opinion, Jesus was and is the one called Christos. But according to the text, it's the idea of the Christos which already exists according to this schema. The Christos is coming. The plan to bring the Christos exists. So it makes more sense to leave aside the Christian theology that wants to import the idea of Jesus back before his birth as a pre-existent entity. What's pre-existent according to this schema is the idea to bring the Christos. The idea to bring the Messiah is what pre-exists according to this schema. So this is a messianic paradigm. And secondly, it's about how the Christos arrives. So there's several aspects to how the Christos arrives, and they're all to do with patterns. So there's the aspect of the pattern of 3, with the 3 beginning points and 3 end points. And there's also the pattern of equal proportions. And in next episode, I'll be talking about the pattern of 14. And the following episode, I'll be talking about the pattern of 5, the 5 messianic mothers. So one of the main points of this genealogical story map is that the Christos arrives according to a particular pattern or paradigm. And at this stage, I'm not indicating which assumptions in the text that I'm sharing with the text, which assumptions I'm endorsing or not endorsing when I talk about the divine plan, and whether that implies some kind of control on the part of the divinity to bring it about. That's the topic for the second half of this episode when I look at the topic of divine providence. Why 3 parts? What is the significance of this 3-part structure? Well, last episode I mentioned that the writer could have just as easily started from David, which would have given us only 2 parts. But the main point of not starting with David is to put David as the end point of something. So it's to create the first stage where David is the end point. So one of the reasons of not starting with David is to make David the goal of the first stage. So verse 17 is asking us to picture the genealogical story map, verses 2 to 16. It's asking us to picture 3 sets or 3 rows or 3 columns. I find it easiest to visualize 3 columns where the beginning of each set begins at the top of the page and the 3 endpoints at the bottom of the page. So these 3 columns align side by side, 3 beginning points at the top and 3 endpoints at the bottom. And in this way, we can see the 3 beginning points aligning and the 3 end points aligning. What is the heading for each of these columns? Well, verse 17 tells us the headings, the 3 headings for these 3 columns. The first heading is from the time of Abraham till the time of David. The second heading, from the time of David to the time of exile. And the third heading, from the time of the Babylonian exile till the time of the Christos. So stage 1, or set 1, is a progression towards David the king. It's a progression towards kingship. Set 2 is the end of this kingship. It's the demise of this kingship. So section 1 and section 2, we have the rise and fall of Davidic kingship. And the beginning point for set 3 begins at the exile. It begins after the deportation to Babylon, after the royal family is deported to Babylon, and then ends with the Christos. The one called Christos arrives at the end point of the 3rd stage. So here we have this grand plan, which we can think of as a birth plan to bring the Christos. And this divine plan is in 3 stages. So just as verse 1 introduced us to the biblos genesios, the messianic plan, the messianic birth chart, verse 17 is also talking about this same divine plan, this messianic triadic schematic. So this 3-part schema or story map is about culmination. Specifically 3 kinds of culmination: kingship, exile to Babylon, and the arrival of the Christos. If I was to give a modern set of labels for these 3 stages, then it would be construction of kingship, deconstruction of kingship, and then reconstruction. But is it reconstruction of kingship? Okay, so things are getting interesting. We've got some kind of construction, deconstruction, and reconstruction, and it's often assumed that it must be reconstruction of kingship. The Christos is assumed to be a king who arrives in the line of David, or who arrives to revive the line of David. But there are a couple of reasons why this is probably not what's going on in this 3-part schema. One of the reasons is the idea of kingship is already problematic in biblical texts. And the second reason is to do with the nature of the exile as some kind of death or loss of the system that was built up. So the exile appears to be functioning as some kind of critique of kingship, as a judgment of kingship. Perhaps it would also help to think of these 3 columns or 3 stages in terms of thesis and antithesis and synthesis. In the first set, the thesis would be that the nation finally has a king, but in the second set, this monarchy is dissolved, which sets up the 3rd stage for not just a revival of Davidic kingship. Stage 3 will need to take into account everything that's gone before. Perhaps we shouldn't be presuming that the arrival of the Christos is simply a revival of the old Davidic kingship. We need to take seriously the dissolution of kingship in the 2nd stage. To say Jesus has the rights to rule on a Davidic throne, well, one of the problems with this is that it presumes the idea of kingship is not a problem, whereas the very idea of kingship was itself a problem right from the very beginning, when the people first ask for a king. When the people are asking for a king, and in 1 Samuel chapter 8, Samuel is warning them about how a king operates. A king will conscript your sons and assign them to his chariots. He will conscript them as his horsemen, and they'll run in front of his chariots. He will appoint his officers over thousands and officers over 50s. He will make them do his ploughing and harvesting and produce his weapons of war and chariotry. He will use your daughters as perfumers, cooks and bakers. He will take your best fields, vineyards, and olive groves and give them to his servants. He will tithe your crops and grape harvest to give to his officials and his servants. He will take your male and female slaves as well as your best oxen and donkeys and use them to do his work. He will also tithe your flocks, and as for you, you will become his slaves. When all of this comes about, you will cry out because of your king. So if we notice that kingship is already being critiqued in older scriptures, it would probably be worth noticing that the way the second set ends is part of this same critique. Perhaps in the book of Matthew, the writer is saying, don't look for another David. Don't look for a king. Don't look for a king to liberate people from foreign rule. And if we look at the book of Ezekiel, perhaps this is more similar to what this three-part structure is showing us, because in the book of Ezekiel, the people are being told that they need saving from themselves. It's not foreign rule which is the problem so much as the sins of corrupt leadership. So this salvation from corrupt form of leadership, this seems to be applicable to this three-part story map. The rise of kingship, the demise of kingship, and then the arrival of the Christos. Not as a new David so much as the resolution to a long story, a long three-part plan. So exile comes as a critique of kingship. The biggest critique of all is the exile to Babylon. It's not just the loss of land, the loss of king, the loss of temple. It's a critique of all the theology that goes behind land, king, and temple. It's a re-evaluation of what is the divine plan. And so in Matthew chapter 1, we have this discerning of the divine plan. What the Christos brings is not the old kind of kingship. It's not even really kingship necessarily. I mean, if you want to look for a king, the book of Matthew says, well, here's your king, but it's a humble servant. It's not really a revival of kingship. This is not to say that people in the book of Matthew, the characters in the book, are not expecting some kind of Davidic king. There will be characters who want to refer to Jesus as Son of David, who want a king to liberate the people from foreign rule. But is that the kind of king that the book of Matthew gives the people? No. So king is not really an adequate title. And this is one of the reasons why king and Son of David, these are not favourite titles in the book of Matthew. The ultimate plan is to say, don't look for a king. Don't look to a king to save the people from the Romans. Don't look to a king to save you. The Christos is nothing like a Davidic king. The genealogy, the structure of the genealogy is saying, don't look for a king. The genealogy looks on the surface like a genealogy, like a royal genealogy, but it's the end of royal genealogy. It's the end of royal ideology. Kingship will not save the people. The way the Christos comes to save is not like David. A Davidic king would save the people from outside enemies, from outside foreign rule, foreign oppression. But what if the oppression isn't foreign? If the oppression is from within, the people are more in need of a prophet who will speak truth to the leaders about poor leadership or oppressive leadership. Notice also that a critique of kingship is also a critique of hierarchy and of masculinity. The kind of hierarchy which idolizes domination of one man over everyone else, over other men and women. It's a critique of the ultimate ideal male. So a critique of kingship is simultaneously a critique of masculinity. The idea that one male and everyone has to do what that one male tells them to do, this idea of power over others, this is not the kingship that arises. This is not the kingship of the Christos. This is the kind of kingship that's being critiqued. So a critique of kingship is a critique of hypermasculinity and male dominance. If ever there was a paradigm for examining masculinity, here it is. Construction, deconstruction, reconstruction. The first stage, we have moving towards normativity. This is what society thinks it needs. It thinks it wants normativity. Just like the people of ancient Israel think they want kingship. They ask for a monarch. They ask for conformity. The catch cry is, we want to have a king lead us like every other nation. Every other nation has a king. So stage 1 pursues normativity. But this pursuit of normativity is not a long-term solution. It's not sustainable. In the long term, a society needs something much more robust than normativity. It requires a self-critical process of deconstructing this. So stage 2 is the unravelling, the dissolution, the deconstruction of all the assumptions that haven't worked. So facing head-on the problems of this normativity. And so stage 2 is letting go the old ideals, the old authorities that are not valid. The old meanings break down, concepts suffer, ideals suffer, identities suffer. The reality is difficult to accept. We have the complete dissolution of everything that was built up in stage 1. And this is where the third stage begins. It begins in loss. It begins a process that moves towards something new, something that's not identical to the past. What emerges arises slowly in the eyes of those who are not invested in the old power structures, the old systems of power, of rigidity and normativity. In the eyes of the disenfranchised, what emerges is welcomed because it's a resolution to a problem that has not previously been resolved. So perhaps, just as this paradigm seems to be a critique of kingship, which is simultaneously a critique of hierarchy and hypermasculinity, it would mean that just as the very idea of kingship, of visible systems of power, of hierarchy, that very idea is put into question. The very idea of masculinity, or at least hypermasculinity, should likewise come into question. It's also possible that what is being inverted at the end of the second set is not just kingship. It's also possible that what's arriving at the end of the first set with David the king is the idea to build the temple, because it was David the king whose idea it was to build the temple. So it's not just kingship that's standing all throughout the second set. It's the temple which stands all throughout the second set. And then its demise comes at the end of the second set. So the deportation of leadership to Babylon is simultaneous with the demise of the temple. So it's also possible that the first set brings to culmination the idea to build a temple, and then the second set ends with the demise of that temple, and then the end of the third set, the one called Christos, comes to rebuild a new temple, a new kind of temple, a new concept of temple. The concept of a physical temple, a visible structure, impresses people with its grandeur. Well, it's meant to be an impressive grandeur. If you spend enough money and you've built it large enough, it seems to be a very hyper-masculine idea of a physical, visible temple. The idea that men should be building physical structures to honour God. But compare how Jesus responds to the magnificent structure of the second temple, which is still standing at the time of Jesus. Jesus' disciples observe how good it looks, how impressive it is, and Jesus is not impressed. This would seem to be another example where Jesus comes to deconstruct a concept which can easily be associated with masculinity or hypermasculinity, as if to say the monument is not the measure of a man, not how impressive one looks in front of others. So when Jesus' disciples say, "Oh wow, the temple looks so grand," Jesus says, this construction won't last. So placing the value on external structures, whereas Jesus is teaching his disciples about what comes from within. Is it compassion or trying to make a good impression? What comes from within a man? Kindness, gentleness, compassion. These are much more important than having a big temple and making impressive sacrifices in the temple. So according to Jesus in Matthew, people and systems can look upright, superficially can appear to be upright. Jesus in Matthew chapter 23 will have a go at the kind of leadership that is only interested in appearing to be upright, but from within is full of hypocrisy. So we see in the book of Matthew that the Christos comes to save from internal problems, not externalizing the problem. Jesus comes to rescue the people from the trappings of hypermasculinity. So he comes to save not just the oppressed, but the oppressors. It's the hypermasculine elements of the system that need dismantling. And it does seem quite significant that the idea of the temple seems to be a symbol of hypermasculinity. In fact, it's only males, healthy, ideal, perfectly formed males, who are allowed right into the temple in the inner courts. Everybody else is relegated to the margins of the temple. So the temple does seem to be quite a symbol of masculinity. But the idea of a new temple would seem to be a challenge to the very idea of this kind of masculinity. And finally, before I get to talking about the symmetry in the proportions, there's one final point about the three-part structure, about the pattern of three worth mentioning. Notice that the same three-part structure in the story map in chapter 1, it's the same paradigm, the same structure used to tell the story of the life, death, and resurrection of the one called Christos. Not only is it charting the arrival of the Christos, not only is it charting how the Messiah arrives, but it's charting the rest of the book. It's charting the life, death, and resurrection story. So the same pattern that's telling the story of biblical Israel's leadership is the same pattern, the same paradigm to tell the story of Jesus, the Christos. The pattern of both is linked together. So this is how the writer can tell the story of biblical Israel as the story of the Christos. And both stories are about passing through death, if we think of exile as a kind of death. So in both stories, death is not the end of the story. And notice that it's in the book of Matthew that Jesus talks about the regenesis of things. So this idea of regeneration or regenesis is right there from the very beginning in chapter 1. And now it's time to talk about why equal parts. And as I've already mentioned, equal parts resembles cycles of time or seasons. Not ordinary chronological time, but the opportune season or ripened time. First, the time was ripe for kingship. Then the time was ripe for exile. Thirdly, the time was ripe for the Christos to arrive. So this is what scholars mean when they talk about the apocalyptic dimensions in these three parts. The Christos arrives according to apocalyptic time. And this brings us to talking about the cyclic or cyclical nature of this paradigm. So just as we noticed that the three parts were defined by 3 beginning points and 3 end points, notice that each end is also a beginning. David is the end of part 1 and the beginning of part 2. The exile to Babylon is the end of part 2 and the beginning of part 3. And it's possible to see similarities with the end of part 3. The third endpoint is like the first beginning point, because in some ways the arrival of Jesus as the Christos is somewhat like the beginning all over again. The Christos is the end and the beginning. So notice the cyclic or the cyclical nature of these 3 sections. Ends and beginnings are linked together, and so we begin to see the cyclic or cyclical nature of this paradigm. So we can see that one aspect of cyclic or cyclical time is the equal proportions. And it's what I've been calling apocalyptic time, because it's about revealing something, dividing up time in order to reveal something that humans can't immediately see, in order to reveal a divine scheme at work. It's about lifting the veil or removing the facade in order to reveal cosmic time, ultimate reality. So it's meant to reveal the divine agenda. This is where I need to unpack the idea of what we mean by a grand plan, a divine agenda, the grand plan to bring the Messiah, according to this 3-part paradigm suggested in the book of Matthew, as something that's shaped by the divine. And people often call this divine providence. Well, what do we mean by divine providence? So I'd like to unpack what we mean by divine providence and then talk about the idea of exile and whether it's part of the grand plan or an intrusion to the grand plan. I'll begin by talking about what is meant by the divine will in the book of Matthew. Although God hasn't been mentioned yet in the book of Matthew, the divine agenda is being implied. And it's being implied as something that humans can discern, primarily through the study of the scriptures. And we should take note that it's not God who does God's will in the book of Matthew. It's really humans who do God's will. Humans are either acting in line with God's will or acting against the divine will. So the divine will or the divine plan for humans, according to the book of Matthew, is not something that's fully mysterious. It is something that can be ascertained. It can be discerned by humans by reading the scriptures and by listening to the interpretation of the scriptures that Jesus, as the Christos, will give his disciples in the book of Matthew. In the book of Matthew, people are acting either in line with the divine will or not acting in line with the divine will, which is why it's so interesting at the end of chapter 1 to find Joseph and to hear that he is making a plan. And as readers, we are wondering, is Joseph going to do something that's in line with the divine will or not in line with the divine will? And I really do need to clarify something about divine providence. When people use the word providence, the idea of divine providence is sometimes presumed that it's about the divine control of things, but that's not something that we see in the book of Matthew. Any being that controls another being in the book of Matthew is called demonic. These are beings who are opposed to the idea of acting to benefit others. So we shouldn't be using the word divine providence as if it means controlling things or people. The divine doesn't control things or people in the book of Matthew. And the word providence basically means provision. So it's supposed to be about providing good for someone. So the provision of the Messiah is divine providence because it's about providing something good for humanity. Likewise, what living things need to exist, the basic conditions for life to exist, oxygen, water, sunlight, these are basic components of the natural environment on Earth, linked with Earth's seasonal cycles. So, according to the book of Matthew, these things are not provided conditionally, they are simply given providentially, which is intended for the well-being for all living things. And these aren't provided based on who's good and who's bad. In the book of Matthew, Jesus says these things are just provided for the righteous and for the unrighteous, out of beneficence, out of good provision. And so the disciples are encouraged to live based on this model, to offer love and prayer for their enemies, based on this model of divine providence, providing good to others without strings attached. So in the book of Matthew, the people who do the will of God are those people who are not lording over others, not trying to control other human beings, but submit themselves as servants of others, servants of love and compassion. These are the people who are said to be doing the will of God. These are the people performing God's will on earth. So when Jesus suggests to his disciples how to pray, he says, "Pray that God's will is done on earth as it's done in heaven," which implies two things, which implies that angels in the heavenly realm act in accordance with God's will, and humans on earth should likewise try and act in accordance with God's will. But it also implies that a lot of what's happening on earth is not God's will. There are a lot of humans who are doing things that aren't in line with God's will. So it doesn't make sense to say, oh, well, that happened, it must be God's will. That's not what the book of Matthew teaches. It's in the good deeds of people that the will of God can be detected. And it's in evil deeds that we can see the opposition to what would be the divine agenda, to see good done on earth. So it's in good deeds towards humanity that humans do towards and for each other that reveals God. So a good summary of this is found in Matthew 5 verse 16, where we see that it's the way people live in doing good deeds to others, which indicates that it's God at work in those deeds. It's humans doing those deeds, but it's God at work doing those deeds. Yeah, so we need to keep in mind that controlling forces in the book of Matthew are called evil forces. So I hope that clarifies a few things about what Matthew means by the divine will and what is the proper use of the term providence. Hey, but what about all the judgment passages in Matthew? There's a lot of judgment passages in Matthew. Don't they imply that the divine takes control of things in the end? The book of Matthew does portray Jesus as returning as judge. But that's a different topic. For the time being, we're talking about how things work, according to the book of Matthew, before Jesus returns. After Jesus returns, certain aspects of society are no longer tolerated, but that's a different matter. The question and the answer about whether or not God controls people or things, the answer is no. Perhaps part of the problem is also due to a common misreading or misconception of the way passive verbs are used when there's no subject attached to the verb. For example, it will be uprooted, you will be thrown, and people often presume, oh, that's a divine passive. We'll fill in the gap and we'll provide God as the subject to that verse, but no, that's not in the text. So there are a lot of verbs in Matthew in which we probably shouldn't be presuming are about divine passives, about the divine doing things, and that's another topic that I'll get around to talking about in a later episode. Now, we've still got quite a few difficult issues to unpack. If we go back to verse 17, what is the writer's perspective of the exile? What is the perspective in Matthew of the exile? Is it different to the perspective of other biblical writers? Well, this is not an easy question to answer because there's a variety of perspectives and assertions made about why exile happened. Well, whatever we think of this three-part paradigm in Matthew chapter 1, exile is definitely a low point. It's the low point for the leadership and a low point for the people in general, and it's a low point for Israel's God. It doesn't look good for Israel's God. Originally, the common interpretation would have been to see that the loss of Jerusalem and Temple made Israel's God look bad. It made it look like the God of the Babylonians must have been stronger than the God of Israel. The people of Israel would have to admit that their God didn't save them from the Babylonian Empire. And so the ramifications of the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem by the Babylonians was theologically profound, having to deal with the fact that the people were not saved from outside destruction. Why didn't the God of Israel save the people? If we think of, on one hand, we have the opinion that exile is not part of the divine plan, and on the other hand, you've got the perspective that exile was part of the divine plan. But I think we also need to recognise a third option that's not necessarily one side or the other. So, for example, if we look at an early Christian interpretation, like John Chrysostom, who said that the exile to Babylon was part of the divine plan, because it was intended to put an end to certain corrupt practices. For example, the horrific practice of human sacrifice in the worship of foreign gods like Molech in the Hinnom Valley, according to the book of Kings and Jeremiah. And so there's the idea that the exile comes to put an end to those practices involved in the worship of foreign gods. The exile was the result of cultic infidelity and of behaving like the original inhabitants of the land who were originally exiled. And a good example of that is 2 Kings chapter 17. And the prophet Jeremiah listed a whole series of sins, not just idolatry, but a whole series of different sins. So Jeremiah is saying it's all kinds of political failures and moral failures on behalf of the nation, and that it was many, many different sins that led to the exile. Is the exile in Matthew chapter 1 supposed to be an intrusion to the divine plan or part of the grand plan? Which is it? One theory is that it comes to thwart the divine plan, and then the divine plan gets back on track. The plan isn't completely overrun, it's not completely overturned, but God returns. The exile gives God an opportunity to rise up and save the nation by bringing them out of exile, because exile threatened to extinguish the whole nation, and it seems to be threatening to extinguish the whole idea of the divine covenant between God and Israel. So perhaps it seems to be like a return of this chaos which God originally overcame to create inhabitable land, and then that's being dissolved with the exile. And then so in this schema, we don't lose hope because there's recreation happening. Out of the loss and death of exile, there's new creation that's emerging at the end of the third stage. And the other alternative makes it sound like, no, exile's part of the plan. God decreed it. The divine will includes exile. God knew that exile would happen. It's all part of the grand plan. I don't think this is quite what Matthew chapter 1 is saying. I don't think either option does justice to what chapter 1 of Matthew is saying. So I don't think the writer of Matthew would agree with either of these options. It's either an intrusion to the divine plan, or it's all part of the divine plan. I don't think the writer thinks that the exile pushed God out of the way and then God came back, got off the floor and got into action. And I don't think the writer is agreeing that exile is part of the plan. I don't think there's an easy way to resolve it. But I think the problem again lies with modern understandings. We want to find a grand theory. We moderns want a big theory, a grand meta theory. Grand theories swallow up all the little stories, all the little theories, and force them into a single theory. We want one grand theology, and I don't think that's something that we'll find in the book of Matthew. It's not a systematic theology. It's not going to give us one single theory. I think the symmetry of the three-part structure in Matthew chapter 1 would seem to imply that exile is not about foreign intrusion into the divine plan. It seems to be something that's more of a natural order of things, a natural cycle. So I think the exile is in the middle of this paradigm as a low point, but a natural occurring low point where the fault lies with something that's within the system. It's a development of internal issues. Internally, the idea of having a king, this is a ticking time bomb of self-destruction. When we begin with the Davidic kingship, we end with the loss of Davidic kingship. It's showing us the natural breakdown. And this is why it's cosmic, because this is how the cosmos, this is how natural cycles work. Things rise and fall naturally. So in this paradigm, starting with kingship ends with the loss of kingship. And this fits with the opinion in Kings that really it's the kings that bring the downfall of the nation. And likewise, we can see that the process that begins with kingship ends in the demise of kingship. We can extend this to see that likewise, a process that begins with masculinity, idealizing masculinity as normativity, will also come to an end. This second stage is a stage of self-decay, like a natural cycle. Tides ebb and flow, flowers bloom and fade, the moon waxes and wanes. The day of kings and hypermasculinity has come and gone. It's within the natural cycle of things. So to have symmetry in the pattern, the three-part pattern in Matthew, doesn't mean that things are divinely controlled. It just means that things run their course, indicating the natural cosmic state of things. Another problem with verse 17 is the way the writer is imposing the structure of symmetry onto the timeline. The problem with this pattern is that it's imposed. The writer knows that there are more kings than the kings mentioned in set 2. The writer knows that there were more kings than listed between David and the exile. There are a few kings omitted. And in the first set of names, this already appears to be a condensed set. Even though this is the same names found in the book of Chronicles, this is the same number. It already seems to be a condensed list. The thing that's most problematic for me is the logic. The logic of saying here is a discernible pattern which is revealed only by modifying the way we count. What we include and what we exclude in order to make the structure work, and then, it reveals a structure. That logic doesn't work. It's very circular for my mind. How can we say that the structure's there if we've imposed the structure on it? It's an artificial construction imposed onto the so-called genealogy. This is a problem for modern readers. Was it a problem for ancient readers? After giving this some thought with the logic which seems illogical, it seems illogical to say, oh, look at the structure that I've imposed, and implied that it's not imposed, as if the conclusion supports the method. This seems quite odd to me. It seems completely the wrong way around. Why would the result of such a reading affirm the method of interpretation? But this seems not to be a problem for the writer of Matthew. The writer has discerned a symmetry of time, a symmetry of stages, by shaping the genealogy a certain way. That sounds like circular reasoning to me, because I've been taught to distrust this kind of bias in data collection. But how can I expect Matthew to be sharing my viewpoint here? And this is where it helps to understand that the purpose of compiling this kind of genealogical account is to make a point, is to make a deliberate point about the final person. The idea wasn't to be unbiased. The purpose was to show bias. This is very different to the way we might construct a modern genealogy. In a modern genealogical account, we would try to avoid bias and pretend that we're compiling it without an agenda. This is the opposite to what an ancient genealogy would be about. An ancient genealogy was compiled with a clear purpose, an explicit bias, an agenda to validate and affirm something about the final member of the genealogy. In this case, the writer of Matthew already believed that Jesus was the Christos, the Lord's anointed one, chosen to lead the people. The writer has traditions about Jesus to that effect. So this genealogical story map is being released to the public. This published genealogy is meant to be revealing something that the writer already believes about Jesus' chosen status, that Jesus was part of the grand plan, a plan stretching all the way back to David and Abraham. So the conclusion that Jesus must have been the Messiah is the bias for compiling this genealogy. His connection is not necessarily historically oriented like we would prefer. In other words, the compiling of an ancient genealogy was an openly biased practice, quite opposite to how we would think of compiling such a genealogy. So we shouldn't expect the genealogy in Matthew to conform to our modern obsession with disinterested methods. First century audiences would be baffled by such an idea. They would not expect the writer of Matthew to be disinterested or unbiased. This is where a modern obsession with historical details tends to get in the way of understanding the text. And this is one of the reasons why Christians have had difficulty understanding verse 17, because the emphasis is on the interpretation of events rather than a disinterested extraction of what exactly happened. Perhaps the best succinct example of this problem is found in Luzz's commentary, where he points out that traditionally the church has held on to the historical aspect of the genealogy in Matthew. And that's fair enough. In the first few centuries, they had their own debates about Jesus and his historicity, but it's an example of why scholars have got stuck on verse 17. It's a good example of how trying to hang on to the historical aspect hasn't gotten us very far, and it's created this dilemma about how to interpret verse 17. Many scholars have tried to apply a historical critical methodology, rather than recognizing the paradigm according to verse 17 is not primarily historical at all. Let's not get bogged down in historical details. There are a few modern examples where we are willing to go with the representation rather than get bogged down in details. If, for example, there is a modern day company wants to have a meeting where they look at graphs of sales or customer satisfaction, and they want to compare these graphs over time with the previous year and the year before and the year before. Well, one way to look at these graphs is to zoom out and to make a conclusion based on the overall structure that emerges from zooming out, rounding down, rounding up, representing a rough idea. The big picture can show the trajectory. Another example is if I try to draw the outline of Australia. But if I wanted to, I could draw a rougher representation with only a few sides. So it becomes a symbol, a representation. And most people can immediately recognize that shape and know what it represents. And a third example is when a cartoonist might draw a sketch of a familiar character, say a celebrity. And most people can immediately recognize who this caricature is meant to represent. Even though it doesn't look like an accurate sketch of the person, it's a representation of someone. And these are the best examples I can think of to show how rounding up and rounding down, zooming out, giving a rough idea, giving a rough sketch, where the point is to represent. So the best example is probably the example of looking at a graph where you want to zoom out, you want to know the overall contours of the graph to identify the big picture, to identify trajectories. And I think this helps us to understand the structure in the genealogy. The writer is wanting to reveal something to make this structure more visible. The writer is saying that structure can be revealed by zooming out, rounding up and rounding down to make it more visible. So, in conclusion, in this episode, I resolved several issues that were left unresolved in the previous episode. Last time I talked about verse 1, which seemed to be giving something more than origins. The Biblos Genesios Jesu Christou seemed to be not only about origins, but about the whole life of the Christ. It seemed to be about a trajectory, heritage and legacy. It also seemed to be about a trajectory of a kingdom of justice and righteousness. And so verse 1 seemed to be introducing much more than just a genealogy. Well, in this episode, we saw all these things come together and begin to make sense by studying verse 17, which says, "Therefore, all the generations from Abraham until David are 14 generations, and from David until the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations, and from the deportation to Babylon until the Christos, 14 generations." This genealogical chart is about making various connections and making various points. It tells us how the Christos arrives is significant. The way the Christos arrives at the end of the third stage tells us something about the kind of leadership emerging. So in this episode, I looked at the meaning of verse 17, because verse 17 is all about the structure in the genealogical chart. And we saw that this schema gives us three parts, three equal parts, resembling cycles or seasons, where the beginnings and endings are linked. And we can see three stages: the rise of kingship in stage 1, the fall of kingship in stage 2, and in stage 3 we saw the development of something new. Modern labels would give us construction, deconstruction, reconstruction. And we can see that these three stages can also apply to the idea of the temple, and then the demise of the temple, and then rebuilding a different kind of temple. We can also apply these three stages to the life, death, and resurrection of the Christos: generation, degeneration, regeneration. And I also looked at the idea of divine providence, the provision of something good. So the idea to bring the Messiah is something good, but how does the exile fit into this plan? If the exile is not something good, and the divine is always about bringing something good, how does the exile fit in? Is it within the plan or outside the plan? Is it part of the plan or an intrusion to the plan? And neither option seems adequate. So a third option seems to be about the natural cosmic proportions of the paradigm. In this way, the exile in the middle seems to be part of a natural process, a natural cosmic cycle of rise and fall, a natural breakdown of a corrupt form of leadership that is not long-lasting. So the idea of kingship is not really a good idea. So we see that self-combusting. Likewise, the process of decay can also be applied to the natural process of masculinity, where it works towards normativity and then it breaks down. So in this paradigm, Exile is a sign that the system was inherently flawed. That kind of leadership won't last. It's not eternal. It's not meant to last. And likewise, normative masculinity is not something that's meant to last. But it goes through a natural process of building up and breaking down. And normative masculinity is not eternal. It's inherently insecure. The day of kingship has run its course. Likewise, the day of normative masculinity and hypermasculinity and masculinized religion has also run its course. The time of kingship and the time of normative masculinity have come to an end. So verse 17 is not asking us to read historically so much as asking us to read mythically and apocalyptically. That's the end of this episode. Thank you for listening.